message after the tone.
Hello, Mr. Smith. The election is drawing near. Have you decided on your vote? If you haven't, please let the Republic Party make the most of your precious vote. Thank you and have a nice day.
Precious vote? Yeah, right.
The video I made on Prime 3 a few months ago was really all about how its controls were essential to its fun factor. It's not that it didn't work with a traditional dual analog scheme, it's just that my overall experience with it was hurt by not playing it the way it was intended to. Precise aiming with the Wiimote offered a high quality FPS experience, and even the more gimmicky aspects of motion controls made for a pretty good time as somebody who hasn't played a game like that in a while. And over the past year, I've come to really appreciate games with non-traditional control schemes. The days of vastly different consoles are over. Games are going to look, run, and control pretty much the exact same way no matter which platform you play on, and in the grand scheme of preservation and meeting the player where they're at, I don't really mind things being this way. But it also means that everyone has gotten used to most games controlling the exact same way. I think it takes out a key angle in a game's design that leaves it up to other things like mechanics and game feel taking on a heavier weight. Now, those should already be good, of course, but an interesting control scheme can do a lot for me. Whether it's just a fresh and interesting way to engage with a game or a complete and genuine overhaul that makes me reconsider how a lot of games in its respective genre should seriously look at pulling from, I can't help but find them interesting. Unfortunately, a lot of these games are just pretty old now. I want to talk about one game that fits the former category today and one that fits the latter some other time. Both 6th generation games though. Consoles around this time were finally starting to reach that point of visual and interactive unification I think we eventually saw in the 7th generation, but the rules weren't quite set in stone. That means we got some really weird shit that still doesn't feel too detached from what we've got now. By 2005, first-person shooters on console were starting to find their footing with things like Halo's dual analog control scheme. On paper, the GameCube controller had every button and stick it needed to replicate this scheme, but in practice, I can't think of a single game that functioned that way. I looked it up and I guess Time Splitters did, but I've never played that. Either way, it was rare. It always seemed to me that the GameCube's stunted D-pad and little nipple of an analog stick made traditional first-person shooters less viable, and that's how we got stuff like Metroid Prime's tank controls and lock-on system. Killer 7, however, takes things in its own direction. It's an on-rail shooter that changes perspective depending on whether you're exploring or whether you're killing. Being on rails like it does means everything will seem a little simpler, but actually controlling it feels amazing, and it makes perfect sense for the GameCube controller. In an interview with GameSpot, Goichi Suda said that he considers the GameCube version of Killer 7 to be the original, the one they developed for, and the one they pulled the source code from when porting it to PC. I never knew this game even made it to PS2, much less launched on the same day as its GameCube counterpart, but I digress. Movement and exploration in Killer 7 is very simple, and it's what you're going to spend most of your time doing. You're stuck to a single path, no matter what, and you can only move forward on that rail. It just makes sense then that the most important action is mapped to the biggest button on the controller. The analog stick and face buttons' traditional functions are swapped. You hold the A button to move, the B button to turn around, and only use the analog stick to pick a direction when you're prompted to. The feeling of slowly adapting to Killer 7 is where I had the most fun. On-rails movement allows the game to do a ton of cool things with its camera and play with certain design elements like enemy placement, how enemies act, and non-combat situations like puzzle solving, which is a very important aspect of this game, unfortunately. It's one of the times where a simpler control scheme on paper allows for unique complexities in its gameplay. The highlight of this entire game for me was the Olmeda boss fight, where you're stuck in this never-ending loop of ambulances. I don't know if the level actually changes as you move through it, but it definitely feels like you're running through some sick, insane house of mirrors. You're non-stop running through, flicking the stick in the direction you want to go, back and forth and turning around, trying to get the right angle on the boss to get a shot off. And not having to worry about the camera is what makes this really work. It could be done with a dual analog scheme, sure, but it would not feel as slick.
What happened to Mr. Olmeda? Huh? This blood. tastes like Mr. Almeida's. So, he's dead, isn't he?
The actual combat is about as simple, but it's just as satisfying. Playing Killer 7 on PC gave me the option to use a mouse and keyboard, something that I use 99% of the time in first-person shooters so that I can have the easiest and most accurate experience possible. But I didn't use it here. I like the challenge of using the analog stick to aim when it's something I'm usually not comfortable with. It's not a twitch shooter, it's not even in first person the majority of the time, and the game's pretty forgiving with its critical hit areas, so I didn't mind playing this way. You use the exact same buttons to shoot as you do to move, with the only difference being holding down the right trigger to shift to first-person aiming. You can't move while you're here, so you have to keep a good distance from your enemies, the Heaven Smiles, who are always trying to grab you before self-destructing. And this is where traversal and combat start to intersect. Spacing is a very important part of combat, especially when one-on-one encounters evolve into crowds that will easily overwhelm and send you back to your last save point before you can even blink. Making that space, though, is a little trickier than just moving backwards. You have to let go of the right trigger, press B to turn around, wait for that animation to play out, press A to move, press B to turn back around when you get enough space in between you, and then transition back in first-person mode to start shooting again. It probably sounds like I'm over-explaining the action to validate a point, but it really does feel like this. I didn't pull this off successfully too often because enemies were too close before I realized I needed the space and couldn't turn around in time. It felt like I was fighting with the controls every time I had to do this. Killer 7 doesn't really afford you the time to panic, and that's because in my experience, the buttons never feel like they could be pressed in conjunction with one another to execute certain actions. They feel static and separate from each other, instead of the more blended, one into another feeling newer games have now. You can do a quick turn while running forward, but this isn't really viable when you have little to no room to move forward in the first place. It's my only real criticism of this combat system, but considering I didn't run into this situation that often, I don't think it takes much away from what is still a pretty cool game. Like I said before, I think this game fits into the refreshing category of interesting control schemes rather than a revolutionary one. It felt good to play something that threw me for a loop like it did. Its unique gameplay necessitates a different way to interact with it, and there's no real reason we couldn't get a game that plays like this today. I don't play dungeon crawlers, but it looks like it shares similarities with that genre, kind of, and those are definitely still around. Killer 7 relies on a lot of gimmicks to keep things fresh, like its character switching and its boss fights that do little to really test your skill, minus the ambulance fight and maybe a couple others. It's no God Hand, its gameplay didn't really change how I think action games could function or control quite like that one, but I did really enjoy what Killer 7's controls had to offer as a one-off experience. Jesus, I'm gonna have to make a video about God Hand.